On November 20th, 1986, Marques Johnson was 30 years old, a reigning comeback player of the year, and still one of the most versatile forwards in basketball. Then his head struck the body of a teammate during a game in Dallas. The collision ruptured a disc in his neck and, for all practical purposes, ended the prime of a career that had already produced 5 All-Star selections, an All-NBA first-team honor, and one of the most important positional ideas in the modern game. The injury should have been the entire tragedy. It was only the beginning. The Los Angeles Clippers stopped paying his salary during the dispute that followed, and Johnson later said owner Donald Sterling threatened to crush him financially unless he settled on the team's terms. Months later, Johnson lost his 15-month-old son in a swimming pool accident. In less than a year, the game, the money, and his family life all seemed to fracture at once. That is the conflict behind a name basketball remembers only in pieces. Marques Johnson was the best college player in America, a 5-time NBA All-Star, the forward who says he gave the sport the term point forward, and the star who helped Milwaukee sweep Larry Bird's Celtics out of the playoffs. Yet the part of his life that explains why his name faded cannot be found in a single box score. It runs through an injury, an owner, a private struggle, and a loss no award could repair. To understand how a player that gifted reached such a brutal turning point, the story has to return to the beginning, to a family that crossed the country for a different life, a dream tied to UCLA, and a boy who broke down crying after his first college practice. The person who convinced him not to quit was his father. Marques Johnson was born on February 8, 1956, in Natchitoches, Louisiana, a small old town in a part of the country where, in those years, a black family knew exactly where the lines were drawn and exactly what crossing them could cost. When Marques was just 5 years old, the family packed up and moved west to California. The reason wasn't only opportunity. It was, in part, an escape, a deliberate move away from the racism and segregation that the young boy had already brushed up against in his earliest years. They landed in South Los Angeles, and that's where Marques would be raised. But this wasn't a household that left learning behind in Louisiana. Both of Johnson's parents were school teachers, people who believed in books, in discipline, in the long climb of education. His mother went on to earn a master's degree in library science from the University of Southern California. His father worked as an assistant basketball coach at Crenshaw High School. So in the Johnson home, 2 worlds lived under one roof from the very start, the world of the classroom and the world of the court. They weren't competing forces. They were braided together, and there was a guiding star over all of it. The family was inspired by Jackie Robinson, not just as an athlete, but as a symbol of what a black American could break through and achieve. Robinson had famously been a UCLA man, and for Johnson's parents, that detail mattered. They came to believe that a place like UCLA represented something specific and reachable, proof that their children could rise as far as their talent and their work would carry them. Education and basketball, dream and discipline, all pointing toward one shining idea. That dream wasn't vague. It had a precise address: Westwood. And before long, the most famous coach in America would pick up a telephone and call the Johnson house himself. By the time Marques Johnson reached Crenshaw High School, the talent that had been forming in that teacher's household was impossible to miss. He didn't just make varsity, he became the best high school player in the entire city. In 1973, Johnson was named the Los Angeles City Section 4A Division Player of the Year, the top schoolboy basketball player in one of the deepest talent pools in the country. In a city stacked with future college and pro players, Marques Johnson stood at the front of the line. And that kind of standing gets noticed by the right people. The right person, in this case, was a man whose name carried more weight in college basketball than anyone alive: John Wooden, the Hall of Fame coach of UCLA. By the early 1970s, Wooden's Bruins weren't just a good program, they were the most dominant machine the college game had ever seen, rolling up national championships at a pace nobody had touched before or has touched since. As the story goes, Wooden reached out to Johnson directly, by telephone, shortly after a UCLA championship game had ended, the coach himself on the line, asking whether Marques wanted to be a part of what they were building. That timing has long been passed down as part of the program's lore, the image of the great Wooden calling a Los Angeles teenager almost the moment the confetti settled. Whatever the exact minute, the meaning was unmistakable. The most famous coach in America wanted the best schoolboy in Los Angeles. And that schoolboy was a hometown kid whose parents had tied their whole dream to this exact place. He arrived in Westwood expecting to step into glory. Instead, within a single week, a teammate had reduced the future College Player of the Year to tears. Here's the thing about walking into the best program in the country. Everybody there was the best player from somewhere, too. When Marques Johnson showed up at UCLA as a freshman, he wasn't joining a rebuilding project. He was joining a juggernaut already in motion, a team riding a historic winning run, stocked with names that would one day land in the Hall of Fame. Bill Walton was there, the towering redhead who was rewriting what a center could be. And Jamal Wilkes was there too. Silk, they called him, for the smoothest game anybody had seen at the forward spot. Wilkes played the same position Johnson did, and in that first week of practice, the lesson came fast and it came hard. According to the account Johnson and his family have shared, Wilkes blocked every single one of his shots. Not most, not some, every one. The kid who had been the king of Los Angeles couldn't get a thing off against the man in front of him. And it broke him down. Johnson, the celebrated recruit, went to his parents in tears, shaken to the core, wondering if he even belonged. It was his father who steadied him, the same father who coached at Crenshaw, who knew the game cold. He didn't sugarcoat it, and he didn't pile on. He told his son the simple truth. Jamal Wilkes was the best forward in the entire country. Getting your shots blocked by the best forward in America didn't mean you were finished. It meant you had just met your measuring stick. And Marques, his father promised him, was going to be just fine. That moment did something. Being humbled at the very top, by the very best, reshaped how Johnson worked and how he saw himself. The sting became fuel. And 2 seasons later, that same teary-eyed freshman would be holding a piece of the last championship a coaching legend would ever win. In his sophomore season, Marques Johnson helped lead the Bruins to a championship that would close one of the greatest books in the history of the sport. That title was John Wooden's 10th and final NCAA championship. Think about that bookend. The young man who had cried in his first week of practice was now a contributing piece on the last great team Wooden would ever raise up. For a kid whose family had tied their whole dream to UCLA, there could hardly have been a more perfect chapter. But Johnson was just getting started. By his senior year, he had grown into the centerpiece, and he played like it. He averaged 21.1 points and 11.1 rebounds per game, leading his team in both categories. Those weren't just good numbers, they were the numbers of the best college basketball player in America, and the awards confirmed it. Johnson won the very first John R. Wooden Award, the trophy named for his own legendary coach and now given each year to the top player in the college game. He took the Naismith College Player of the Year. He took the USBWA College Player of the Year as well. 3 of the sport's highest individual honors, all pointing at the same man. Away from the court, a second set of skills was already taking shape. Johnson majored in theater arts, continued the love of performance he had discovered in high school musical theater, took a sportscasting class, and hosted a campus television program. None of it seemed as important as basketball while he was becoming the best college player in America. Years later, after one collision removed the game before he was ready, those choices would give him somewhere else to stand. The best college player in America was about to be sent somewhere he never pictured himself. A cold northern city where, as he'd later joke, it snowed more than it had in a quarter of a century. When the 1977 NBA draft rolled around, There was no mystery about whether Marques Johnson belonged in the first few picks. The best college player in America doesn't slide, and he didn't. The Milwaukee Bucks called his name with the third overall selection, locking him in as the cornerstone of a young team trying to find its footing. The man who would coach him there was Don Nelson, and that, more than anyone realized at the time, was the beginning of the single most important relationship of Johnson's professional life. Nelson would shape his career, lift it, and years later, in ways nobody could have scripted, complicate it. First came the shock of geography. A South Los Angeles kid raised under California sun was suddenly living in Wisconsin. Johnson joked for years that his first Milwaukee winter brought the city's heaviest snow in a quarter century, and the second was its coldest in 30 years. The numbers belonged to his storytelling, but the culture shift was real. He had gone from beaches and familiar streets to a place that initially felt like another planet. And yet, listen to how he talked about it decades later when the Bucks announced they'd retire his jersey. The bitterness about the cold was gone. What remained was something warmer. He described arriving in 1977, 21 years old, fresh out of LA, with, in his words, stars in my eyes, carrying nothing but the dream of becoming a great NBA player. And he described what he found waiting for him, a nucleus of young, hungry talent pulled together from solid programs all over the country, a group with a real chance to build and grow together. That, he said, was the heart of it. Not one game, not one trophy. The whole thing, the youth, the climb, the shared rise. Within months, those stars in his eyes were showing up on the stat sheet. And one December night in 1978 would produce one of the most ruthlessly efficient scoring performances of his entire life. Some rookies need a year to adjust. Marques Johnson needed about a week. In his very first professional season, he put up 19.5 points and 10.6 rebounds per game, numbers that would make a veteran proud, never mind a 21-year-old learning the league on the fly. The honors followed naturally. He was named to the 1978 All-Rookie First Team, stamped immediately as one of the brightest young talents in the sport. Johnson finished second in the Rookie of the Year, voting behind Walter Davis, the smooth-scoring guard from Phoenix. Years later, the same two men would meet again in the voting for a very different award, with the order reversed. If the rookie season announced him, the second season made him a star in full. Johnson didn't just improve, he exploded into the upper tier of the entire league. He finished as the third leading scorer in all of professional basketball at 25.6 points per game. Read that again. Out of every player in the NBA, only two men scored more. George Gervin, the Iceman, one of the silkiest scorers the game has ever produced, and Lloyd Free, the man who would later legally change his name to World B. Free. To sit one rung below those two as a sophomore in the league was to announce yourself as something special. And then there was the signature night, the one that still makes people who saw it shake their heads. December 12, 1978, against the Phoenix Suns. Johnson poured in 40 points, and he did it on a shooting percentage that almost doesn't look real. 74% from the field, 40 points and 12 rebounds on 3 out of 4 shooting all night long. That's not hot, that's surgical. That season, he earned a starting spot in the 1979 All-Star Game and a place on the All-NBA First Team, the league formally recognizing him as one of the 5 best players alive. The efficiency makes more sense when you picture the choices he forced on a defense. At 6'7" and more than 200 pounds, Johnson could establish himself against a smaller wing, turn into the lane, and finish through contact. Give him space and he could rise before the help arrived. Send the second defender, and the forward who would later initiate Milwaukee's offense could find the open teammate. Miss at the rim, and he was strong enough to fight for another possession. He did not need to monopolize the ball to control a night. The scoring, rebounding, and passing came from the same advantage. Defenders could rarely match both his size and his skill. At that stage, his career looked built for a long argument among the era's greatest forwards. He was young, efficient, durable, and already recognized at the highest level. Nothing in Milwaukee suggested that his prime would end through one accidental collision rather than a gradual decline. That is why the years before Dallas matter so much. They establish how much basketball remained available to him when the future was suddenly taken out of his hands. But scoring was only part of what made Johnson different. He was about to put his fingerprints on something bigger, a word, a role, a whole idea of how the game could be played that basketball still argues about to this day. Every so often, a player comes along whose game doesn't fit the boxes the sport hands out. Marques Johnson was one of those players. He had the size and strength of a forward, but he could handle the ball, see the floor, and run an offense like a guard. For most of his career, that versatility was simply a luxury, a nice bonus on a star. But in the 1984 playoffs, it became a necessity, and out of that necessity came a phrase that's now stitched permanently into basketball's vocabulary. Here's what happened. Milwaukee got hit hard by injuries at exactly the wrong spot. They ran short on healthy point guards right when they needed them most. Don Nelson, by then a coaching mind always willing to break the rules of how things were supposed to be done, looked down his bench and made a decision that was ahead of its time. He turned to his star forward and told him to bring the ball up and run the show from the front line. "Set up the offense," Nelson said, "from your forward position." According to Johnson's telling, his response in that moment gave the idea its name. He said, in effect, "Okay, so instead of a point guard, I'm a point forward." The attribution matters. Johnson claims he coined the term, while former Bucks assistant Del Harris later offered a different origin connected to Paul Pressey and earlier work with Robert Reed. What cannot be disputed is that Johnson performed the role, a forward trusted to initiate the offense when Milwaukee's guards were unavailable. Think about what that means in today's game. The modern NBA values exactly this kind of player, a large creator who initiates the offense, pushes after a rebound, and blurs the line between forward and ball handler. Teams now build systems around that versatility. Johnson helped define what basketball would later call the point forward, and by his account helped name it, during an era still inclined to place players inside rigid positional boxes. That same versatility had already carried Milwaukee somewhere remarkable the spring before, into a head-to-head playoff showdown with Larry Bird that ended in a sweep almost nobody talks about anymore. For a stretch of the early 1980s, the Milwaukee Bucks were one of the most consistently dangerous teams in basketball, and Marques Johnson was at the center of it. This wasn't a flash. It was a run. Division titles. In 1980, 1981, 1982, 1983, and 1984. 5 straight years sitting atop their corner of the league. Twice in that span, in 1983 and again in 1984, they pushed all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals, knocking on the door of the NBA Finals themselves. And then there's the moment that ought to live in every highlight reel about that era. May 2nd, 1983. Game 4 of the Eastern Conference semifinals. On the other side stood Larry Bird and the Boston Celtics, the franchise, the dynasty, the standard. The Bucks didn't just beat them, they swept them, 4-0, and Johnson closed the door himself with 33 points and 9 rebounds in that clinching game. Think about what it took to sweep a Larry Bird team in the playoffs. That should be a story passed down for generations. Instead, it's become one of those buried facts that makes you wonder how a career this loud got remembered this quietly. The run didn't end in a title. Few runs do. After climbing over Boston, the Bucks ran into the eventual champions, the Philadelphia 76ers, a juggernaut led by the unstoppable Moses Malone, who would be named the league's most valuable player. Philadelphia was simply too much that year, but the sweep of Bird remained, a marker of just how good Milwaukee and Johnson truly were. The roster even produced a small visual first, because Marques Johnson and Mickey Johnson shared a surname and first initial. Their full names appeared on the backs of their jerseys. It was a bookkeeping solution that became a piece of NBA uniform history. But beneath all that winning were two different struggles that later accounts often compress into one. Contract holdouts, including an 18-game absence and a separate period of treatment for a private dependency problem. For all the polish and all the winning, the Milwaukee years weren't as smooth beneath the surface as the box scores suggested. There were fractures, some about money, one far more personal, and they tell you something about both the man and the era he played in. Start with the money. Twice during his Bucks years, Marques Johnson held out for a better contract. The longer dispute kept him out of the first 18 games of the 1981-82 season. Players did not yet possess the leverage modern stars take for granted, and a holdout could turn a fan base against a player quickly. Johnson nevertheless believed an elite forward drawing people into the arena had the right to fight for his value. The private struggle followed a different timeline. Reporting published after the Clippers trade placed Johnson's treatment at a rehabilitation center in 1983. It should not be described as the cause of the earlier 18 missed games. The treatment revealed a dependency battle running beneath the public success, but Johnson was not simply absent for 18 games because of it. In fact, he appeared in 80 regular season games during the 1982-83 campaign. Separating those facts matters because carelessness turns two difficult chapters into one inaccurate scandal. Together, the contract fights and private treatment provide a fuller picture than the all-star resume alone. One concerned public value and control. The other concerned a struggle Johnson would later discuss more openly. Neither cancels the championships, playoff performances, or responsibility he carried for Milwaukee. They show that the smooth public rise contained pressures the box score could not record. And the man who had drafted him, coached him, and built so much of that Milwaukee run around him was about to make a decision that would change everything, sending Marques Johnson back to the very city where it all began. In the offseason of 1984, Don Nelson made the call that would close the Milwaukee chapter for good, and here's the wrinkle that made it sting a little more. Nelson wasn't just the coach anymore, he was wearing the general manager's hat too, which meant the man who had drafted Johnson, developed him, and built so much of that golden run around him was now the same man signing off on shipping him out of town. Nelson sent Johnson, along with Junior Bridgman, Harvey Catchings, and Cash to the Los Angeles Clippers. Coming back the other way were Terry Cummings, Craig Hodges, and Ricky Pierce. On paper, it was a bold swap of real talent, but for Johnson, it was something more loaded than a transaction. It was a ticket home. The kid from South Los Angeles, the Crenshaw legend, the UCLA hero, he was being sent right back to the city that raised him. The Clippers played their home games at the Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena, just a few miles from the old neighborhood where he'd grown up and gone to school. After 7 winters in Wisconsin, after all those jokes about snow he'd never asked for, Marques Johnson was finally coming back to the California sun. It should have been a storybook return. But this is where the story turned shadowed, and it has to be told carefully. The following year, after Johnson publicly disclosed an earlier private struggle from his Milwaukee days to the press, the Clippers reportedly attempted to undo this very trade. The claim, according to reporting tied to the Los Angeles Times, was that the Bucks had failed to disclose that history. Now an attempt is not an outcome. There is no clean court ruling documented to say how that effort ended. What matters here is the picture it paints. A homecoming wrapped in suspicion with a brand new team apparently trying to wriggle out of the deal that brought him there. And the basketball itself only deepened the gloom. The homecoming didn't feel like one. His first season in a Clippers uniform produced career lows, and the team around him was sinking toward one of the worst stretches the league had ever seen. Leaving a winner for a loser does something to a player, and Marques Johnson felt every bit of it. In his first season with the Clippers, the 1984-85 campaign, his game cratered in a way it never had before. Career lows in scoring, career lows in shooting. This was a man who had finished third in the entire league in scoring just a few years earlier, who had swept Larry Bird out of the playoffs, suddenly looking ordinary. Some of that was the disorientation of a new system. but a lot of it was simpler and harder to fix. He had gone from a culture of winning to a culture of losing. And that kind of change seeps into everything. And these Clippers didn't just lose, they lost historically. Across Johnson's 3 years with the franchise, the team never won more than around 32 games in a season. In his final year there, the bottom fell out completely, the Clippers stumbling to 12 wins against 70 losses, one of the worst marks in league history at that time. Picture that for a man of Johnson's pedigree. He had spent his prime competing for conference titles, measuring himself against the very best, and now he was strapped to a franchise that was the punchline of the entire sport. Johnson himself put words to it later, and they cut right to the bone. Playing for those losing teams, he said, kind of wore you down and made you feel like you were kind of the JV team in Los Angeles. The JV team. Junior varsity. In the same city, in the same era, the Lakers were rolling toward championships and basking in the glow of Showtime, while Johnson's Clippers were the afterthought across town. For a hometown kid who dreamed of LA glory, there might not have been a more deflating way to come home. And yet, and this is what makes the man so remarkable, in the middle of all that losing, he summoned something almost nobody saw coming. A comeback so strong it would win him an award. And the man he beat out for it carried a name that had haunted him since his very first year in the league. The 1985-86 season is where Marques Johnson reminded everybody exactly who he was. The Clippers moved him toward the backcourt, leaning into the same versatility that had helped define what basketball would call the point forward. Even on a struggling roster, Johnson played his way back into the All-Star game, earning the 5th and final selection of his career. On a team going nowhere, he was still operating at the highest level the sport had to offer. The league noticed, and it handed him a fitting trophy. Johnson was named the NBA Comeback Player of the Year. After the career lows of that first Clippers season, after the talk that maybe his best days were behind him, he answered with one of the strongest individual bounce-backs in basketball. That award is supposed to mean something, proof that a player who'd stumbled could rise again. Johnson earned it the hard way, dragging his level back up on a team that gave him almost nothing to work with. But here's the detail that turns this from a good story into a poetic one. Remember the rookie season all the way back at the start? Remember the man who edged him out for Rookie of the Year? Walter Davis, the smooth scorer out of Phoenix? Nearly a decade later, the wheel came back around. The player Johnson beat out to win Comeback Player of the Year was that very same Walter Davis. The man who had taken one piece of hardware from a young Marques Johnson now watched an older, battered, fully proven Marques Johnson take one right back. Basketball doesn't usually write its endings that neatly. This time, it did. So think about where that leaves us. Johnson had just silenced every doubter. He had proven that even on a broken team, even after a down year, he was still an elite NBA player, still an all-star, still capable of the kind of season that wins awards. He was 30 years old. He had a future. And that's exactly what makes what happened next so cruel. Because on a November night in Dallas, in a single violent instant, all of that momentum was about to be snapped at the neck. It happened in the kind of moment that passes in a half second on a basketball court, the sort of accidental contact that occurs 100 times a night across the league and almost never leaves a mark. November 20th, 1986. The Clippers were playing in Dallas, and in the chaos of a single play, Marques Johnson's head collided with the midsection of his own teammate, the big center Benoit Benjamin. There was nothing dirty about it, nothing intentional, just two large, fast-moving athletes meeting at the worst possible angle. But the result was catastrophic. Johnson suffered a ruptured disc in his neck. A ruptured cervical disc is not a sprained ankle you tape up and play through. This was the kind of injury that contemporary news reports, like the wire dispatches that followed in the months after, openly described as career-threatening. And in truth, it was. For all practical purposes, that collision in Dallas ended the prime of Marques Johnson's career. He was 30 years old. He was a fresh comeback player of the year, A five-time All-Star, a man who had just demonstrated he still belonged among the best. And in the space of one accidental impact, the league lost one of its most gifted and versatile forwards. That's the part worth sitting with for a moment. This was not a player limping toward the end of the line or hanging on past his usefulness. This was a man stopped mid-stride, with real basketball still left in him. The collision did more than injure his body. It became the dividing line between the career Johnson actually had and the longer, fuller one still within reach. And as devastating as the physical injury was, the cruelest part of this chapter might be what came after it. Because almost immediately, the wound stopped being only medical. It became financial. It became legal. Within months, the team stopped paying his salary, and a phone call with the owner of that team would allegedly turn into something far uglier than a contract dispute. The injury had broken the momentum of Johnson's career, and now his relationship with the Los Angeles Clippers broke along with it. According to contemporary wire reporting from the spring of 1987, the team stopped making payments on Johnson's salary, a contract worth $1.3 million. The Clippers' position, as reported at the time, was that Johnson was permanently disabled, and that under the terms of his deal, that changed what they owed him. The team also reportedly claimed he had given no clear reason for delaying a recommended spinal fusion operation. That was the franchise's stated stance. One side of a fight that had moved off the court and into the cold language of contracts and disability clauses. But it's what Johnson himself has said about this period that turns it from a business dispute into something that makes your stomach drop. Years later, in an interview published by NBC Sports, Johnson laid out the timeline in his own plain words. In 1986, he said, I had what was really a career-ending neck injury, and in 1987, I lost a son in a drowning accident. He was talking about the worst 2 years of his life stacked back to back, and in the middle of that, he recounted, an intermediary arranged a phone call between him and the owner of the Clippers, Donald Sterling. What Johnson says happened on that call is his account, his telling, and it should be carried exactly that way. But it is chilling. By Johnson's description, I called Donald up and he told me he was going to ruin me, that he was going to crush me financially, and that I needed to go ahead and settle on his terms if I wanted to have any money left. Sit with that for a second. This is a man whose body had just been broken on the job, who was staring down the end of his livelihood, and in his account, the response from the top of the organization wasn't compassion. It was a threat to destroy him. Now, there's important context for who Donald Sterling would later be revealed to be, a name that, decades on, would become synonymous with disgrace in the league. But in that moment, in 1987, Johnson was just a frightened, injured player on the phone with a powerful owner, allegedly being told to take the deal or be crushed. The basketball loss was already immense. But Johnson had just hinted at something far heavier hanging over that same stretch of time. A loss inside his own home that no contract, no comeback, and no award could ever touch. There are losses that basketball can absorb, and then there are losses that have nothing to do with basketball at all. This is one of the second kind, and it has to be told plainly, without dressing it up, because the facts themselves are heavy enough. On May 15, 1987, Marques Johnson's son, Marques Kevin Johnson Jr., was 15 months old. A baby, barely walking. On that day, the little boy fell into the family swimming pool and drowned. That is the whole of what the record holds, and it is not the place to invent more. A father, already reeling from the collision that had cracked his career in half just months earlier, now faced the kind of grief that reorders a person's entire life. Think about the calendar Johnson was living through. In the span of about half a year, a man near the height of his profession had lost the thing he did better than almost anyone alive, and then lost something infinitely more precious than any game. Johnson himself would later set those two blows side by side in his own words when he spoke about that stretch of his life. In 1986, he said, he had what was really a career-ending neck injury, and in 1987 he lost a son in a drowning accident. He didn't separate them. He carried them together because that's how they came. And here is where the private struggle that had once pulled him off the floor in Milwaukee returns to this story. Not as scandal, but as the honest cost of being human under unbearable weight. After his son's passing, Johnson again went through therapy, working through grief, working through a return of the substance battle that had shadowed his earlier years, working through everything that loss can dredge up in a person. He has spoken about that period openly in the years since, not to dramatize it, but because he came to understand that hiding it served no one. The pain was real, the recovery was slow, and it would one day shape a mission he'd build with whatever years he had left. But even buried under all of that, the broken neck, the financial fight, the unthinkable loss inside his own home, Marques Johnson was not quite ready to let the game end on terms that weren't his own. And the man who would hand him one final NBA chance was, of all people, the same coach who had once shipped him out of Milwaukee. Most players, after everything Johnson had been through, would have walked away and never looked back. The body said, stop. Life had said stop in the cruelest way imaginable. But there was a stubbornness in him, a refusal to let the final word on his playing days belong to a collision in Dallas. So he tried to come back. More than once, and without much success, he pushed his battered body back toward the league that had been taken from him. And then, in October of 1989, the door cracked open one last time. The Golden State Warriors signed him. Part of what drew him there was a familiar face running the bench, Don Nelson, his old Milwaukee coach, the very man who had once traded him away years earlier. The two of them reunited after everything one more time. There was something fitting in that, a circle closing, and maybe a quiet hunger to prove that the player Nelson had let go still had something left to give. The reunion was brief. Johnson appeared in just 10 games for the Warriors before the team waived him on December 1st, 1989. 10 games. After all those all-star seasons, after leading the league's scorers, after sweeping Larry Bird out of the playoffs, the NBA story ended on a roster move in early December, quiet and almost anticlimactic, the kind of transaction that barely registers in the news. The forward who had once been the best young scorer, not named Jervin or free, slipped off an NBA roster for the final time, and that was that. But the talent itself hadn't vanished. It had only run out of room on the American stage. After Golden State let him go, Johnson took his game overseas, signing with Fantoni Udine in Italy. And there, far from the bright lights of the league that had broken his heart twice over, he averaged 23.6 points per game. Read that number again. This was a man supposedly finished, a man whose neck had been described as career-threatening, still pouring in better than 23 a night against professional competition. The stage had changed. The player, when healthy, was still very much himself. The basketball was finally drawing to a close, but Marques Johnson had never prepared for only one kind of stage. The theater arts major and campus broadcaster had spent years developing another language for performance. Now, Hollywood and broadcasting offered a place to use it. This was not a celebrity improvising a second career from nothing. It was an older version of the student who had chosen classes, rehearsals, and camera work before professional basketball consumed his schedule. The injury ended one career abruptly. It did not leave him without another set of skills. Johnson found his way onto the big screen. He took small but memorable roles in films, most famously as Raymond in the basketball comedy White Men Can't Jump, alongside parts in Blue Chips, Forget Paris, and Love in Action in Chicago. The White Men Can't Jump role landed in a way that stuck. The film's director, Ron Shelton, called Johnson fabulous in his big scene, and to this day, fans still walk up to him and quote his lines back to him word for word. That's not a courtesy gig handed to an ex-athlete. That's a man who could genuinely act, finally getting the chance to do the other thing he'd trained for all those years earlier. But the deeper second career was behind the microphone. Johnson became an early morning radio co-host on the Clippers' flagship station, KFWB-AM in Los Angeles. He moved into television as a color analyst for the Seattle Supersonics in the late 1990s, then built out a broadcasting resume that carried him onto national platforms. The young man who'd practiced interviewing on a campus show had grown into a respected, polished voice on the sport he'd once dominated. And then came the most satisfying turn of all. Johnson went back to Milwaukee, the very city he'd landed in as a wide-eyed 21-year-old, the place he used to joke buried him in more snow than he'd ever seen, and became a television analyst for the Bucks. The relationship had come all the way around. In 2018, his work earned him an Emmy as the top analyst in the Midwest region. Think about that arc. The city he once arrived in as a nervous rookie became the city that handed him an award for his second career decades later. Few players ever get a redemption that clean. That long road built toward one particular night in the spring of 2019 when Milwaukee finally raised his number into the rafters for good. But even that honor, as glowing as it was, sat right beside a battle Johnson says he is still fighting, quietly, every single day. On March 24, 2019, the Milwaukee Bucks retired Marques Johnson's number 8, lifting it to the rafters where it will hang for as long as the franchise exists. It was the city's full embrace of a player who had once felt like a Californian in exile and ended up one of the most beloved figures in its history. And that honor didn't stand alone. UCLA had already retired his number 54 back in 1996, and in 2013, he was inducted into the National Collegiate Basketball Hall of Fame. His name still ranks among the Milwaukee franchise's top career figures across the categories that matter: points, rebounds, the markers of a player who gave a team the best years of his life. One national honor still has not arrived. Johnson was again named a finalist for the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame in 2026, this time through the Men's Veterans Committee. When the 9-member class was announced in April, his name was not included. 5 All-Star selections, 3 All-NBA teams, a Wooden Award, an NCAA championship, and a central role in one of Milwaukee's strongest eras have repeatedly carried him to the edge of enshrinement without taking him through the door. That unfinished argument is not a decorative grievance. It is evidence that basketball still remembers his career less clearly than the resume deserves. The legacy stretched beyond his own career, too, right into his bloodline. His son, Marques Johnson, walked almost the identical path his father had, starring at Crenshaw High, then heading to UCLA, where he became an NCAA champion in 1995. Marques and Marques hold a distinction no other pair shares. They're the first father and son both honored as Los Angeles City Section 4A Player of the Year, and they stand among a tiny handful of fathers and sons to each win an NCAA basketball title, the only 2 to have done it at the very same school. Another son, Josiah, went into entertainment, helping create a television comedy series, carrying forward that performer's streak that ran through the family. The dream Johnson's schoolteacher parents had carried out of Louisiana, the one pointed at Westwood, had echoed forward into another generation. But the fullest measure of the man isn't in the banners or the bloodline. It's in what he chose to do with the hardest parts of his own story. As of recent years, Johnson has been working to build a program in Milwaukee to help men struggling with the same kind of battle he once faced, the substance struggle that shadowed his playing days and returned in his darkest hours. And he doesn't speak about it as something safely in the past. He describes it as a challenge he still works to overcome in himself, in his own words, every single day. So that is Marques Johnson, the best college player in America, a 5-time All-Star, and a man who helped bring the point forward into basketball's vocabulary. He swept Larry Bird, returned from career lows to become an All-Star again, and still scored professionally after a collision had interrupted his prime. He endured a financial fight, the loss of a child, and a private battle he now tries to help other men survive. He became an actor, broadcaster, Emmy winner, and a number in 2 sets of rafters. The Hall of Fame still has not called. The fuller answer to who he was has been available all along.